Hello everyone, today we talk about the Byzantine warhorse between the 11th and the 13th centuries, the age of crusades, and in fact of any other military issues that, as we know, the Byzantines continuously faced. This is roughly the Komnenian era. We do not stick to any particular dynastic framework here. During the 13th century. There's the conquest of Constantinople, the Latin Empire, the reconquest of Constantinople by the Byzantines. There is also a previous period, for example, the Byzantine Cataphracts had been developed in Niceforian times to become some of the heaviest kind of cavalry in history. We do not know exactly when they stopped existing. In a consistent military sense, likely they continued throughout the entire Komnenian era. I also made a video on the Niceforian Cataphracts, among the earliest ones in Schwerpunkt first year, I think. We could remake it because, of course, I would know how to make it better, but I also wouldn't like to focus too much on sort of the elite, the exception. That point, of course, reflects, however, a pretty strong structural capacity. However, as we know, because we've seen it in many videos about Byzantine warfare, the average Byzantine horseman tended to be actually a lighter one, especially compared to the West. There were lots of horsemen from many different places, and especially from a numerical point of view, the Pontic steppes, or coming actually through the Pontic steppes from much far away places. This was not a novelty. However, it is true that in Komnenian times, we've seen it not only in military historical videos, but the ones that illustrated the main changes in the Byzantine states from especially the Macedonian, in fact, to the Komnenian era. There was a remarkable shrinking of the traditional recruitment system across the entire regions on essentially a levy basis, especially because of the destructuration followed to the loss of Anatolia, where actually the most important tagmata were recruited from, together with their, in fact, fiercely famous cavalry forces, and a reliance mostly on Constantinople and the capacity to levy money that at this point is, of course, coming back also in terms of strict monetization in Europe, in the Mediterranean, to hire lots of foreigners from many different parts, as we already observed, of not just of the immediate surroundings of Constantinople. And that would tend to, in fact, increase that level of lightness, obliging the Byzantines also to recur to Western mercenaries in order to actually stiffen their ranks in terms of heavier cavalry. In fact, that's actually the greatest influence that you can see better, especially after the Byzantine Empire is destroyed in 1204. That is to say, the heaviest and increasingly heavier, even just by the advancement in arms and armor and just the political and social system that backed it, Western men-at-arms. And an ever lighter cavalry from especially the Turkic world that will really become an important divide also for example, in the Balkans beyond the same Byzantine world. Right? The Eastern Balkans, for example, are much more influenced by the Turco-Mongols, whereas the Western Balkans will be increasingly influenced by the Italians, the French, the Germans. We have made some videos from the original warfare series describing this divide in particular. It's essentially the difference between a solid state and a failed one, right? Raiders, looters, horse archers of sort belong to that sort of more tribal and or statally decayed reality. The heavier knights, ever more, not just ever better equipped and served, but also ever more homogeneous in their compactness of heavy knights, especially towards the end of the 13th century. That's quite evident. Like milites are at large much more homogeneous than infantry forces, even in the West, right? They're essentially almost all very heavy. There is no substantial difference between the knight and what would have been the squire back in the day. And this is all a set of changes that occurred within this chronological framework we're discussing today, and it makes it also sort of difficult to simply generalize about the Byzantines if it wasn't for the fact that, of course, we have to approximate and to assess, in fact, what this warfare was concretely about. I will talk more about Byzantine warfare at some point. We have to cover it in great detail. Of course, we have to understand also what the Byzantine army was before. We haven't really talked about that too much. There's no specific reason, except perhaps in the specials we haven't pointed to Byzantine history as much as the cycle content. One step at a time. We really made a lot about Byzantine warfare, nevertheless. Now, sources for horse furniture during this middle Byzantine period are limited to really a small number of stylized images, which is typically Byzantine. Recently I made a video explaining essentially the great misconception that seems to be rooting among the masses, sometimes for very contemporary, contingent political reasons, that would like to make of the Orthodox world some sort of bulwark of tradition as opposed to the degenerated West and whatever. In this period, the Byzantine world is giving way to the Western one. It's definitely not more advanced at the beginning of the period. They are basically at the same level. Of course, also the differences were not staggering in an absolute sense compared to, of course, what medieval civilization could be. But if you look at the indicators that point to the same development of military technology, etc., the Westerners are basically booming, whereas the Byzantines do not have properly the tools to cope with this, to compete, and they end up, quite wisely by the way, in opening a path that in theory could have even saved them, to adopt Western elements. There were some enlightened Byzantine emperors who realized, such as Emmanuel, that I think was one of somehow underrated ruler, had understood that the Latin influence was necessary in order to safeguard the solidity of the empire. There were so many Western knights that served the empire at this point, not just the Byzantines, by the way. Some served the same Seljuks, like some Byzantines did by themselves, so that the Westerns are actually spreading everywhere in this actually conflictual, competitive way with these powers, but at the same time, of course, providing them with the same force to pursue their own goals. Byzantine society is not as effervescent and sort of diversified like the Western one. Even though the 11th to 12th century are really great centuries of expansion, and it's fair to say, of course, that the same Byzantines were witnessing a period of important revival of enormous military force as well. They almost wiped out the Siculo-Norman kingdom. They actually almost reconquered the entirety of Anatolia after Manzikert and before Myriokephalon. There is, in fact, from one side, too much rigidity and determinism regarding the idea that the Byzantines were just to simply collapse and end. That's actually not true. But when you also confront this with what was happening in the West, you realize that even just iconographically or documentally, we do not have the same amount of evidence that the West produced. Byzantine society was more sclerotic, was more crystallized, was somehow xenophobic in a conservativistic rather than traditional way, and in this sense they lacked the means to simply put out more exceedance, more extra force. They were able to achieve their goals in many circumstances exactly in some ways because of this rigidity, because that also helps their autocratic regime, their sort of very controlled social hierarchy was very useful to maintain an important degree of internal order, aside from all the usurpations. Those were actually normal if you look at what the Westerners or the Arabs were doing. It's somehow similar, but also in there with major differences. For example, the Westerners did not, even in the development of their feudalism, prevent the development of local autonomies in parallel. Well, this is absolutely instead unknown in the Byzantine world, in spite of the fact that the Komnenians have abandoned for good that sense of older Byzantine statehood. We're pointing definitely to the privatization of the entire system, but still in a Byzantine way that would stick to this oligarchy that was not to be open to any other intermission. Also because the entire empire revolved around Constantinople. I mean, there wasn't much of another autonomous chunk of the empire that could seriously continue on its own as the center, right? There are rump states after 1204, but of course they do not go very far. Also, when the Paleologoi conquer Constantinople, that's an empty shell. That's also because, of course, of the Crusader looting, but it's a very different empire from before, and many communities had actually taken the opportunity to autonomize themselves from Constantinople after the Latin conquest, even though they did not like the Latins at all. So things naturally are even more complicated than I'm making them, but it's important even just in terms of the evidence you can use for a topic like the one of today's video, right? When it comes to equine military equipment, these sources are confined to literary references alone. There is essentially no room for certainty regarding the fine details. We can grasp something, right? There is also a general skepticism also by certain scholars that say, okay, since maybe for these very centuries we don't have any clear, explicit evidence of this and that, we can't, for example, talk about Byzantine horse armor at this point. Why? After all, we know that the Nicephorian Cataphracts was still around. We know how they had to be equipped. There is abundant evidence at the end of the day. So why not simply extending it to this period, given that it's not like things, especially in a material sense, were changing too much for anyone involved. Of course, horse armor was there. We're talking probably about the metal one, right? It has not disappeared. It's obvious that the Nicephorian Cataphracts could not be maintained by the say the post 1204 Byzantine states, because that core had been established properly in a time of major power in terms of political cohesion and territorial extension, and it was so expansive that it was just this traumatically imposant force. Just a state of that dimension could even hope to think to be able to maintain, and for a purpose that, tactically speaking, wasn't even the game changer. So ideally, it was about fielding a cavalry so heavy that nobody could defeat, but it's not really that warfare is decided even in a time in which, of course, mounted troops were that important. There are pros and cons, and even about the actual employment of those cataphracts. relatively few. Again, we will come back on the topic, and also today we will address briefly what is the essence of such cavalry. What's the function? What's the point? The purpose of even having it at that point? Because not even Western cavalry was that heavy, and as we pointed out, it's not like the Byzantines had actually a heavier cavalry on average than the Westerners. So that was also combined with much larger numbers of much lighter cavalry at the same time. It must be contextually understood. In practical terms, there is little scope for functional variation in elements like bridles, for example. The primary distinction shown in illustrations is the presence or absence of a nose band, which is not this much of a military indicator. There are a few depictions of curb bits. The majority of images do not really feature any distinctive characteristics, so it must be assumed that these were snaffle type bits of some sort. We'll see now how tempered these horses were, because there was a preference in this Eastern tradition towards mares, as a matter of fact, as opposed to stallions, that were more about a Western thing. It's also the way you deal with mares is less brutal than you have with the studs. Now, decorative elements could be applied to bridles, particularly ornate roundels at the intersections of the pieces, and occasionally on the brow band. For the rest, the design of horse equipment seems to have remained remarkably consistent, which is not just a Byzantine thing, but pretty much what you can see around the region across time and even different cultures. As we said at the beginning, there is a significant Eastern equestrian influence, a nomadic one to be more concrete. This, of course, heavily informs the Byzantine military, though technically there was a preference for geldings and mares over stallions, we said, which essentially led to the use of less brutal methods to control mounts compared to Western practices. They were about, instead, controlling much more powerful, angry, aggressive beasts. You never have to underestimate how actively participating the horse is in medieval combat, kicking, biting, punching with the head, and more. While curb bits were used, variants of the snaffle bit were more prevalent. Bridles, we said, it changed little over time. They're actually very similar to the ones that we still use today. Of course, the pack of wealthier riders often served as a means of displaying status, with decorative metal plaques and ornamental roundels adorning the bridle straps and junction points. Consider that steppes horsemen, we will see now better the Central Asian influence, were very much loaded with specific traditional objects like little bells, for example, as the manifestation of divine power through such heavenly music connected with winds. This echoes, of course, great part of the Indo-European legacy, but also, for example, the more strict adaptations like in Islamic warfare. Think about the Nakara Kana. Think about how this blended even peoples like the Khwarezmians that considered the sound, the audible element, being the very manifestation of this power through the elevation of drums, even to divinity. The Byzantines had actually a bit more of an Apollonian sense of their cavalry themselves. Drums were mostly like a Middle Eastern influence. Of course, the Byzantines had a lot of that, but that's a tonic instrument to drill the masses, the swarms of horse archers. Even though the Byzantines have that, these troops are mostly auxiliaries. They are not technically Byzantine, right? In some cases, you have the Byzantines, of course, adopting the very material culture of these peoples as well, especially when it was practical. But this is the reason why the horse armness was, after all, so similar among various peoples, because practicality comes first in many ways. But the typical Byzantine hero is the warrior saint that has an explosion of individual capacity and presence. So compared to, say, many Turco-Mongol riders and also the Arab ones, the Byzantines looked much more elite, just like the Westerners looked like this even more. There is an interesting blend, in fact, of the influences, and while it is true that in the Comnenian era the Byzantines definitely began to shift towards an ever more, again, sort of foreign, final rank type of horsemen, hierarchically and qualitatively speaking, the bulk of their forces was, in terms of punching capacity of heavy element, still solidly Byzantine, right? And so even though they also in there, as we've seen, started to hire a lot of Westerners, and there is a lot of course, even in that case, Frankish legacy in the Byzantine military tradition at a certain point onwards, there was still a genuinely Byzantine heavy cavalry, slightly lighter again than the Latin one, but above, we can say, the nomadic, the steppe type of horsemen. Speaking of ornamentation, by the way, it appears that trappings were most commonly dyed red or black. Of course, there were many other different colors. Speaking of armor, especially during the Comnenian era, the Cataphractoi were still around, which entailed not just, as we'll see now, particular type of armament for the knight, but also for the horse, and especially the latter being particularly beefy, heavy, right, capable of sustaining all that weight. These units were expected to engage in frontal attacks against any type of formation. One could wonder whether, in fact, Franks fought against the Cataphracts. Of course they did, in a way or another, also because, as you know, Norse and Norman, as other also Latin cavalrymen, were quite around the Byzantine, and in and around the Byzantine world were actually employed by the same Byzantines for a long time. So there was a massive share of knowledge, of skills. The fact that, for example, the West wouldn't develop cataphracts, as we said before, is indicative, in spite of this awareness of very different contexts, very different functionality. In any case, what the cataphract does is smashing to literally everything that he finds in front of him, including other as equally heavy or slightly less just, in case of civil wars, would have had, of course, both at the same level in some cases, foes, which meant that their horse armor had to be functional for that too. Again, this video is not specifically on a specific type of cavalry, if not just the average, the medium one, so we're talking cataphracts just incidentally here. However, you understand that in that case, there had to be pretty heavy protection that could be actually lamellar armor for the horse as well in the heavier cases. However, we do not have, for this period in particular, as we were saying before, explicit evidence of metal armor being used. We have it, for example, by Byzantine chronicles like Niketas Choniates for the Hungarians at the Battle of Semlin in 1167. Incidentally, by the way, not because they meant that this cavalry, at least he describes Hungarian cavalry in multiple occasions, that was particularly heavy for some reason. But the steppe Asian influence was a thing in the employment of more, especially of chest plates. Like normally the most frequent type of armor, horse armor, was an iron headpiece or iron armor in general. That's sort of the most obvious choice, because it has to smash with the head into the enemy as well. But against archery, which is actually the main reason why also this cavalry, especially in an Eastern context, was so typical, at least throughout history, is that the horse did not have to be pierced by the hail of arrows that would rain on him. And actually, we have seen how during the Crusades, Latin cavalry did not have much of this problem, even though we do not see, in fact, much heavy armor around for it. Probably padded armor was more spread than we think. Iconographically, however, we do not have a great amount of evidence to suggest that any time in history, like, horse armor was more important or as equally important as the riders, except for this kind of cataphracts, right? That were, however, extremely expensive. They didn't have just iron head pieces, but also protective clivania made of ox hide lamellar or laminated felt. In some cases, they would have been full metal armor for the entire horse. That's, again, the sheer cost of it makes it so exceptional that we shouldn't think about it in any other term. But of course, there were these degrees of armoredness. Not everything came out uniform, homogeneous. Consider that the same rider's armor could be, in the wake of this cataphract tradition from Nicephorian times, wearing as many as 3 layers of metal armor plus the padded one, which is insane. I mean, you can't basically move. It's something incredibly heavy. Like there is, of course, the myth that of medieval armor to be particularly heavy, and of course it was heavy, but it was also designed, of course, to move and to do lots of things, including acrobacies, stunts, and so on. However, in the case of these cataphracts, that you wouldn't literally, at least you'd be able to move, but in many ways your function was to be placed on the horse and to charge collectively so that enemy resistance would simply melt away in front of you, just out of the sheer power was delivered against a concentrated mass at speed. And it was extenuating for both the horse and the rider. In fact, few people know, especially for this ultra-heavy cavalry, charges were actually led at pace, because pace is enough by speed to simply smash into enemy lines with that kind of mass. And for the rest, in fact, charges were normally led at canter, which is roughly 45 kilometers per hour, something between trot and gallop. Due to the aforementioned lack of surviving examples and accurate depictions, the form of Middle Byzantine era headpieces remains a topic of guesswork, but it's also not such an overwhelmingly relevant issue. In general, Levantine and Central Asian practices tended to result in more encompassing headpieces than their Western counterparts, likely because, again, of the greater amount of missile around, not actually even necessarily the higher power of missiles. There is this notion that that naturally involves ranges, type of course, of this individual bow's performance, for example, but also, for example, at which distance they were employed, that would like to make you think that these had also more firepower than what. This is actually not correct, right? The development of crossbows, but also in other times in history, like, I don't know, the Roman legionary infantry had a missile power second to no one, right? It's not like you have an horse archer that your advantage because you can shoot from a distance, because the effect of that projectile will be diminished at that very distance. So the same goes for what we can see at this point, the Mongols of Persia, for example, hiring not just Latin knights, but, for example, Italian crossbowmen to employ in the Persian Gulf on their ships. Why would the dreaded Mongols with those terrible composite bows and such great horse archery need Western missile troops? Admittedly, sort of the best ones, but still also numerically contained compared to the level of their horse archery, reflecting this, because we have too much overestimated the East as Westerners, right? And never really objectivized how much we really always had beyond this. So the sense being that Western warfare was much more shock charge compact to a degree. I mean, while Eastern armies would harass each other forever, including the same Westerners, because they didn't have enough shock power to actually smash through them. Look at even the Battle of Manzikert against the same Byzantines. There wasn't even that much of a tactical disaster as we used to think, because the Turks didn't finally break the enemy. They just kept wearing him out. The relevance of missile was smaller, right? Westerners just charged. So even though their crossbows were actually altogether even more performing as their crossbowmen as units, and the delivery of such firepower, there was a much less amount of shot missiles that, in interest of surface exposed to the enemy, could hit. They would cause even more damage, but engagements were quicker and more contained, and so all that anti-arrow necessity would have not really been a big deal. Hence, this, I don't know, Hungarian chest plates that we do not see even in Hungary. Like, we're told by the Byzantines, right? But it's so rare to find any evidence of this kind. Also, when the Westerners at the end of the 13th century start becoming ever heavier, as we were saying before, and in fact, full metal barding in chainmail comes around for their horses, we're not even sure actually what kind of material that is, if it is, I don't know, sculpture. So for the Byzantines, we do not even have that evidence. We just have some passage here and there. And the Westerners also used head pieces as well. So these horses, to a degree, were definitely that well protected. Leather lamellar apparently was an important thing. We talked about lamellar armor, the apparent advantage it has against missile fire. The way it's, the various lamellae are imbricated is upwards, downwards, etc. All has a specific meaning. There is scale around. Still, this is true also up to as west as Germany or Italy. Leather lamellar armor seemingly retained its simple hanging construction with plates laced together horizontally in suspended rows. There were more developed ways of building it, but also what is good enough in terms of cost benefits is what you find around. In fact, this is the medium that we're searching for in today's video. Needless to say, Constantinople would actually maintain really a very high, like talking properly the city and its armories, very high levels of technological advancement in human armors, but for the horse one. Consider that as the Byzantine state privatized in later decade, of course there was a greater reliance from the side of the wealthiest, from the oligarchs, the guys who in fact already own by themselves this massive okayaka within the city with massive estates out there around the empire. Consider that the same Komnenoi had Crete as their backyard where they got their own supplies that they shipped from the island to Constantinople. Would, of course, have in part even their own, at least sources, right, there of arms and armor, private, autonomous ones. But they would also, of course, enjoy or benefit of the excellent, very wealthy and updated Imperial armories, where they could find much of this horse armor as well. This is especially true in the Komnenian era, right? And especially in the first part, right? The peak even of the Cataphracts during the Komnenian period seems to have been the end of the 11th and the early part of the 12th century. After that, it seems that at least the need of having such an overwhelmingly expensive type of cavalry declined. Speaking of more generic military equipment, sources mention head defenses and breast armor for horses. However, rump protection seems to have been less common, as we were pointing out before. For the frontal shock, you really need chamfron and breastplate. Then, of course, you can't cover yourself more against the many projectiles you will be finding while fighting the Turks, some other nomadic people, etc. But it's not so crucial. It burdens you in an excessive way. It's reasonable to assume that the headpieces, of course, were more substantial than leather. They would have mostly been really metal. There is some evidence of this type of armor in the previous centuries of Byzantine history, albeit we do not have evidence regarding the precise form around this era. There is more information available about the other armor used for horses. Ideally, chest and neck pieces were composed of lamella made from ox hide, with a secondary option being heavy laminated felt, so still organic material, which is also largely the reason why we do not have evidence of that, as it perished, rendering it archaeologically untraceable at large. So we definitely see that, of course, the Byzantine Empire suffered destructions, looting, and so on, but we have evidence of heavier arms and armor when we know that there was in a more consistent, numerically consistent way, if anything. So yes, Byzantine horses would have been tendentially lightly armored, and even the heavier ones would be normally using organic protection. Finally, period sources attribute a shoe covering the entire underside of the hoof to protect the animal from caltrops exclusively to the Romans, which is not true, but the Byzantines liked saying it for themselves, just like the so-called liquid, better known as Greek, but actually liquid fire. Also other peoples had this stuff, right? It's just that the Byzantines thought that they had to anecdotally point out that they were the most prominent in their use, the better ones, the ones who knew the exact combinations, how to employ it. It's not quite the point. But this type of shoe covering of the entire underside of the hoof seems to have been essentially a descendant of the ancient hippos handles that you can find in the ancient world. We could make a video about how this continuity occurred. I mean, the hippos handles were present in an era in which there was no metal horseshoeing, and so there was also much less grip. So the fact that the Byzantines had some greater continuity with these means also suggests that their cavalry on average would be, of course, lighter than one that was in the West. Again, we're not speaking categorically here. They had that as well, but just on the wall, these hints tell us that they were lighter, because we don't see this continuity in the West instead, which can be observed also through the same Western influence on Byzantine horse trappings from Western horsemanship. We in fact see saddles during this period having a low pommel and cantle, with no distinctive feature evident in surviving sources. By the 12th century, however, when the Byzantines start hiring a lot of Latin knights in their army, we start seeing the adoption of Western methods, specifically leading to the use of high cantle and high pommel knightly saddles by heavier troops. Surprise, surprise. Imperial would employ method of Latin knights. This is obvious, and it points to the fact that after all, even though this is exactly the period in which, as we've seen, the heavier cataphract gear was not probably much around, the Byzantines themselves had essentially scaled down from that to use sort of more functionally ordered and cost benefits reasonably equipped heavy cavalry on the model of the Western one. This is kind of obvious. We've seen often in the regional warfare videos this mix, this blend of Byzantine and Western horse trappings. Besides the essential girth, saddles were further stabilized by straps around the breast and rump, which also suggests the increase in shock charges. Again, already, of course, always employed by the Byzantines throughout all their history, because otherwise we wouldn't have cavalry to begin with, but evidently increasing at this point, and the evidence itself increasing is not just the fruit of course, the expansion of Constantinople, the fact that it was reviving, starting at this point with a massive power and so on, and that still you would think would produce more. Speaking of decorations, we see such saddles being adorned with a variable number of short pendant, either plain straps or terminating in decorative roundels, some of which we were talking about before, and this depended on factors that were also separated from the strictly Western influence. However, it was at the same time, and also in this sense increasing actually to the extent of the development of specific features of Central Asian influence. The Seljuk Turks, of course, had swarmed into Anatolia. They were just next door to the Byzantines, quite literally. This would have an impact, right? It's not just about the Seljuks, it's also about all the peoples dwelling in the Pontic steppes and the Balkan frontier that the Byzantines have to routinely cope with. However, we see saddles from Central Asia, or after the Central Asian style, characterized by a low pommel and cantle, being widely as uninterruptedly used throughout the period. These four-piece saddles consisted of two arches for the pommel and cantle, as well as sidebars curved to match the average horse's back, and thick in the middle to form the seat. Right, and the basic saddles were used without upholstery, while the better models featured a layer of padding to ease discomfort. This tells you that the Byzantines were capable of adapting to this also rougher riding styles, as much as they used the literal people that, by gentrifying, sort of adopted this commodities. They had sort of more resources. Many of them were settled probably in the Imperial hinterland, so some of them would become Romans for what it meant in this context at the time. Needless to say, this type of Central Asian saddling was functional to horse archery, which to an important degree was practiced by the same Byzantine heavy cavalrymen. We'll talk about this another time, but of course there was in Byzantine military culture a certain emphasis on multitasking, specialization. This stemmed from the necessity of sort of making the most of the troops that were quite costly employed by the state back in the day during the moments of greater needs of survival from the Islamic invasions, etc. And of course, as Byzantine society became more aristocratic, the horsemen too became, at least in the elite, much heavier in retaining part of this multitasking style. Again, they were slightly lighter than, say, their Western counterparts, so the most obvious military consequence is that in order to cope with that type of enemy, you have to specialize in some sort of missile softening up of the enemy formations, and equally countering fierce horse archers like the ones of the steppes and or other peoples that make use of important degree of missile tactics also on the horseback, which was the case for the Levant, probably meant. Consider that, of course, also the Westerners in the first part of this period used a lot of javelins from horseback, also from their heavier type. The Byzantines, however, have a bit more of a archery tradition in that horse archery tradition. They have composite bows, and they have really adopted a lot from the steppes. However, as we have seen with the influence of Western saddling, later in the 12th century, Byzantine heavy cavalry troops who did not require archery flexibility adopted themselves higher pommel and cantle saddles, similar to those used by Western knights. So you can, of course, use, as the Western knights did to a much lesser degree, but still, as side weapon, a missile one, right? It would have not really been strange to see a Western knight in battle with, say, a crossbow as a side weapon, or even a bow, right? For a while, that would have been actually quite normal. We've seen it actually for the Battle of Bourg-Terroude and the knights of the same Henry I of England, Familia Regis. So we're not talking lighter troops. We're talking, well, in that case, they actually were. I mean, every aristocrat knows how to shoot an arrow from horseback for hunting practice. There is not essential difference when you have to target people. But of course, these knights, what I mean is that they were habituated themselves also as the heavier type, as they would preferably fight, like in open field, would and also in other contexts, of course, would fight with auxiliary forces that were actually missile. And you can have, again, a heavier type of knight that is still able performing that tactic with even this heavier type of saddles. Right? So there's nothing strange about that. The Central Asian saddles, in this sense, were considered to be mostly more practical for, in fact, more movemented type of horse riding, right? In practice, ensuring stability for the rider during actually pretty intense stunts, whereas when we see that warfare becomes heavier, also saddles become bulkier, but allowing for less movement and just for mostly not absorbing the impact of the shock charges. So they're just another direction. In addition to girths, saddles were typically equipped with breast and rump straps, which could be made of plain leather or feature status display throughout ornamentation. Even plain straps could be pendant decorations. We've seen them before. The most elaborate ones could feature, for example, multiple metal roundels, similar to modern horse brasses. Laudewise in his Tactica recommended that each trooper carry a saddlebag or bags containing 3 days' rations as a precaution against being separated from their unit, which is consistent, of course, with the type of operational tasks that the average Byzantine horseman would really have, like having this greater proclivity to raiding, to skirmishing, to scouting, and so on, than, say, a Western knight. Now, of course, Leo is a bit ideal, and just a way of saying, okay, go out there with rations, because you may never know what may happen. It's that simple in practice. Those reflect, of course, some level of disciplinary provision too. However, it's important because it tells you that, of course, the same saddles were structured in a way that would allow for this type of gear to be brought with together. So we're talking rations, weapons, including the side ones, so for the heavier troops. And so we've seen how in the Eurasian Steppes series, for example, or the video about Ottokar II of Bohemia, how this sometimes even double weapons were brought. The weavers that could contain also lots of arrows, by the way. So we're talking about pretty consistent, also costly devices. You would think that arrows do not cost a lot, but they brought a lot of them with them because otherwise they could have not been effective, and they cost, right? For the societies of the time, if you look at the same nomads, they made enormous efforts to provide with sometimes armies that could shoot even over 1 million arrows in a single engagement, which is insane, but it also tells you in perspective how many arrows you need in order for them to be effective when shot in a particular way, in that particular context, because essentially you have lighter forces that cannot get too close to the enemy to do that to begin with. And the heavier opponents will actually chase you. We have a lot of evidence of, say, I don't know, Reconquista crusaders chasing the Muslims. The same goes for the Levantine ones. So the myth that heavier cavalry does not chase this uncatchable Eastern riders is a bit of a fantasy. They would have not used the so-called Parthian shot hadn't someone been chasing them, or it wasn't just about surprising the guy who said, oh my god, he's retreating, so he's not shooting, and then shooting. It has to do with that kind of, you're fleeing and somebody's chasing you, which you can explain on average just if the guy is heavier than you, but can still chase you, and it's dangerous. You have to be able to stay distant, and yet you can still shoot at a reasonable range to keep him at bay. Additionally, stirrups were commonly used during this period. It's kind of obvious the Byzantines wore their stirrups, however shorter than the Franks. This is a typical steppe influence as well. The reason why this happens is that you have to be just, I think, a smaller target on horseback. You do not need lots of, say, shock impact absorption through your thighs. The Latins, of course, had developed the heaviest shock cavalry out there, so they needed to have long stirrups to really use all their legs muscles to absorb these devastating impacts and hopefully not being catapulted out from your horse, which in this sense you're not just relying on your legs for. Some knights would literally chain themselves to the saddle, avoiding being catapulted after impact. But that's the main reason. Spurs are absent from most contemporary illustrations, but we do see them as well. For example, in one or two pictures in the XI-XIII manuscript, which is actually made in Sicily, likely by St. Byzantines, or at least very extremely skilled sort of Byzantine style illuminators. The reason being that the way Eastern horses would respond at this command, their capacity to jump around and so on, was sort of also against this milder mounts in terms of shock force, able to direction them more easily, and needing them to be less reminded when and what they have to do. It's possible in this regard that in fact the XI-XIII manuscript was influenced by Western practice. So iconographically speaking, we get those spurs in that codex for this reason. Consider that some Byzantines, possibly of those of Turkish ancestry or extraction, the Turco-Polloi at some point were represented even as the same greatest Byzantine warrior saints, appear to have followed the Turkish custom of controlling the horse by use of small whip suspensed at the wrist, which is a very step thing that indeed, especially in the later period, starts being seen around a lot in the Balkans, because there are literally like Turks entering it, also pretty much unguarded, and other peoples that were connected with them that had adopted it, and so on. The Turco-Polloi thing is interesting. I made a video about them. Sometimes there were literally Byzantines who had changed fighting style. In fact, there were lots of Westerners even that would serve as Turco-Polloi that by the later Crusade era came to define just a type of fighting rather than the original concept of these people being children of Turks that were, however, raised now in our Crusade or Byzantine dominated context, right? Nevertheless, especially after the collapse of the empire during the Fourth Crusade, the Turco-Polloi fighting style would be ever more similar. It's not even a term, as you know, connected much with the Byzantine Empire per se. Being Greek, it shows how still influential, of course, the Byzantine world was, for example, in the Seljuk-dominated Levant for the Crusaders to have the locals, this local communities providing with these types of troops called in that Greek name. There are, again, people even from far away. After the Vespers, some Sicilians do this. Some Greeks literally moved to places like Cyprus, or even the Outremer states. Cyprus was one of them, but the Levantine, okay, even Cyprus is in Levant, but the mainland Levant. And you have a great deal of this mobility, of displacement due to the Frankish conquest, invasion, and so on. I made some example of these troops, not just in the video about the Turco-Polloi, but in the one about the Battle of Pelagonia, that illustrates what this broader post-say Byzantine world was in the second half of the 13th century. Speaking of the mounts themselves, of the horse breeds of the countries of origin. Now, horses were mostly from Anatolia and Syria. Anna Komnene, in fact, mentions Damascus, Edessa, and broader Arab breeds being bought for the army. This is important because Anatolia had already been pretty much of an equestrian place, where the Byzantines had drawn their own finest cavalry. Of course, after the Turks arrived, and it's not even just Turks, telling the truth, there are people coming from Caucasus, Ruthenia, far beyond, right? There are Kurds, etc. But of course, the general Seljuk leadership brings more this kind of horsemanship, not, however, in the latifundium-based kind of style that the Byzantines had enjoyed, also with a much greater degree of irrigation. The Seljuks make that crumble because they're not, they're more primitive, right? And they don't invest, they don't have a functional state like the Byzantine one. They're much more fragmented. So the landscape desertifies a little bit, but there are sort of pastures. There is this more, again, primitive way of horse breeding that fits also those runners, those raiding horses, and those would have been cheaper too. And so the Byzantines would have an easy access to that simply because they controlled all the coastal cities. So in all the valleys of the Anatolian hinterland, you would have to eventually sell stuff somewhere towards the sea, and the Byzantines would have such mounts. Without mentioning, of course, that they use lots of Seljuk auxiliaries themselves, and they fought themselves. Some exiled Byzantine nobleman was raised in these places, some even converted to Islam. We've seen the Firank mercenaries that the same Seljuks called those Frankish and Byzantine, also heavier type of horsemen compared to their own on average. The Seljuks, as you know, having a very sort of heavy elite, but also pretty narrow numerical one. Hence, this is the same relation we're talking about before in proportion between the in kind between the Franks and the Byzantines. I mean, the Byzantines and the Franks in this case. And so obviously the Byzantines had still an importantly heavier type of bias compared to the Eastern cavalries that would appear that heavily armored for the Seljuks. We can see it easily because in these in some of these iconographic evidence there are literally substantially heavy armor types. You don't typically see, at least in the type of style, especially in the, say, Seljuk world. I made a video about the Seljuk heavy cavalrymen, so if you're interested in that, you can check it out as well. As you know, Arab breeds in general were good. Saint William the Conqueror had at least this mixes also with the Berbers from North Africa, from Spain. Another type held in high regard for its speed was called the wild horse by the Byzantines, referring apparently to the same as the Turcoman or Frankish Turkman horse. As you know, it was a very old tradition of Central Asian horsemanship, but also of imports from Central Asia. As far as the Hellenistic kingdoms and the Chinese Empire, the heavenly horses of the Fergana Valley have been the bigger deal back in the day. This Turkomans, intended in a quite generic sense, of course had in part inherited that, and they had pretty good horses, very tough breeds, selected in the steppes, sometimes also further nurtured in more feudal countries like Persia, that was the heartland of Seljuk power, of course, after the conquest from Central Asia. So this type of horse, especially for the lighter types of cavalrymen, the horse archers, was pretty good, because it literally stemmed from the places in the world where the best horse archers came from. However, there was something more typically Greek to some degree. Thessalian horses, in fact, were of very good quality. We were talking about this in the recent video about the Thessalonian army organization from the 14th and the 15th century. Thessaly had, as you know, very good horses since antiquity, and the tradition in those plains of the Balkans had towards the Aegean had continued throughout this time, and so that would be an important source of horses close to the same Constantinople. It was mostly these Thessalonian magnates that sort of controlled this from their estates, and you know that Thessalonica was basically the only true city at this point in the empire, after Constantinople, also one that tended or wished to have simply moved away from it, and in part succeeds even in doing so, after especially the collapse of 1204. Consider that in the 13th century there are literally the Franks ruling the country. So when we talk about Byzantine horsemanship here, we're talking also Byzantine cavalrymen that are serving in the Latin imperial armies and the various principalities that the Latin Empire was essentially also subdivided in. So that there are very, very interesting combinations. We'll have to talk more about this. For the later Middle Ages were better documented. Again, there is also much greater Turkic influence around. Turco-Mongolian one, to be precise. The Mongols did raid the Balkans as well. But one has to consider it in perspective, and especially in the light of this continuous relation existing between the Byzantine world and the steppes, the nomadic steppes, right? To us, the Turco-Mongols, they seem so exotic. They appear after, it's the end of the Middle Ages, the Ottomans, etc. But actually, the eastern portion of Europe, actually up to, in fact, the Balkans, Central Europe, had been massively exposed to steppe warfare, to Turkic horse archery. I mean, think about Hungary, think about the Cumans, who were really used even in Moravia, in Germany. There are lots of depictions of that. We'll have to add it for the historical unit types. You find it in the Manessa Code, even slightly after this period. That continued over and over and over and over again. We made lots of videos. We talked about the Litka Tartars. We talked about the, of course, in fact, Turkic auxiliaries in the Ruthenian armies, the so-called Polovtsi. You name them. There were really many. And so you understand that in this eastern frontier with the Seljuk world, later overrun by the Mongols, by the way, even the Mamluks later, we talked about them a lot, how important horse archery was. And the same traditions of Constantinople we really find having exposed, especially this Pontic dimension for, at this point, almost a millennium. The same thing is true even before the Romans. When you look at the Balkans, there was a lot of Scythian influence and so on. So it's just a thing that had been going on forever. And that's why, in fact, the Byzantines have this greater, in fact, Eastern bias in their arms and armor since ever, since the partition between the West and the East. That would have influences also further west, because, as we said before, southern Italy had composite bows. Historically, you find this is true also for other regions further north. I mean, think about Turkic equipment in Sweden, Vandal era Sweden, Viking era Sweden. I mean, this push of the East had come pretty close, and sometimes it was more from a civilized medium, such as Constantinople, that had filtered these peoples. It also kept them out. The benefit of the West, importantly, but sometimes just through the needs of practice, through this relentless struggle between the sedentary and the nomad. And of course, the horse is a bit the unsung hero of the situation. How many poor horses were killed in these horrifying clashes, and how much they actually believed in their masters and what they were doing. They understood that. I mean, the horse, of course, is an incredibly intelligent animal, and it would have not been used in warfare otherwise. It's really interesting to talk about war horses. I'm checking here because I think I created a playlist on them. Not really. Oh no, yes I did. Oh no, this is not mine. This is actually a series of songs from someone. No, I haven't, strangely enough, but I will have to, because it's quite necessary. We made already lots of this stuff, if I'm not wrong. We talked about some other horse men here and there. We really have to be more concrete about this all. In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.